Story number 1.
The rain had been falling for hours, relentless and unbroken. The narrow road twisted through the dense forest, the headlights of the car barely slicing through the mist that coiled between the trees. Aaron clenched the wheel, knuckles white, the rhythmic slap of the wipers the only sound apart from the rain hammering the roof. The storm had come suddenly, swallowing the sky in thick, rolling clouds, and now the road stretched on endlessly, no sign of life in any direction. He was lost. His phone had died hours ago, and the GPS in his rental car flickered uselessly before giving up entirely. He had followed the detour signs when the main highway had been closed, but now he was sure he had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trees loomed closer, their dripping branches clawing at the edges of the road, and an uneasy feeling settled deep in his gut. Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw it. A house. It stood just off the road, barely visible through the mist and darkness. An old Victorian, its pointed roof and shuttered windows giving it the look of something abandoned, forgotten. But the porch light was on, a single flickering glow against the storm. Relief washed over him. He pulled into the narrow driveway, tires crunching on wet gravel. Maybe someone inside had a phone charger. Maybe they could point him toward the nearest town. Anything was better than driving blind through this storm. He stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter as the rain soaked through in seconds. The house loomed above him, its walls warped with age, the wood dark and swollen from years of exposure. The wind howled through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles. He climbed the porch steps, noting how they sagged under his weight. He knocked once. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, louder this time. No answer. Aaron hesitated, glancing back at his car. The road behind him was lost to the rain, the forest pressing in on all sides. Then he saw it. Through the window, a shadow moved. Someone was inside. Relief flooded through him again, and he knocked a third time. The door creaked open. The hallway beyond was dark, stretching into unseen rooms. A faint candle flickered somewhere deeper inside, its glow barely reaching the threshold. "Hello?" he called. Silence. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. The door swung shut behind him. He turned sharply, reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flared in his chest. He twisted it harder. Locked. A slow creak echoed from deeper inside the house. Someone was there. He forced himself to breathe. Maybe it was just an old mechanism, a house settling in the storm. Maybe whoever lived here had locked it behind him as a precaution. "Hello?" He tried again, stepping forward. The hallway stretched on, lined with old paintings, their colors muted by dust and time. The candlelight flickered from a room to his right. He moved toward it. The parlor was filled with furniture draped in white sheets. The candle sat on a small wooden table, its flame barely flickering despite the draft that curled through the house. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. And then he saw them. Footprints. Wet, leading from the doorway into the center of the room. His stomach twisted. They weren't his. A sound came from the hall, a faint shuffle, barely more than a whisper. Aaron turned sharply, heart hammering. "Is someone there?" His voice sounded too loud in the silence. A floorboard creaked. His pulse pounded in his ears. He stepped back into the hallway, scanning the darkness beyond. The candle's light stretched only so far, and the rest of the house was swallowed in black. Then from upstairs, a thud. Aaron's breath caught. It was unmistakable. The sound of movement. Someone was up there. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. But the door was locked and his car keys sat useless in his pocket. Maybe someone really did live here. Maybe they hadn't heard him. Or maybe they had. He swallowed hard and moved toward the staircase. The steps groaned under his weight. The banister was slick with dust and something else. Something wet. He wiped his hand on his jacket, refusing to look too closely. Another creak from above. His breath hitched. The upstairs hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, damp with something that smelled like mildew and old water. A single bulb flickered weakly overhead. The footprints continued here, leading down the hall. To the last door. Aaron's fingers trembled as he reached for the knob. It turned too easily. The door swung inward. The room beyond was dark. Then lightning flashed. For a single blinding moment, the entire room was illuminated. And he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the room, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her frail form, water pooling at her feet. Her arms hung limply at her sides. She was staring at him. The light vanished, plunging the room back into darkness. Aaron stumbled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The air was too thick. The house was too silent. Then the whisper came. "Help me." His blood ran cold. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him. His hands fumbled at the knob, twisting, pulling, locked. The whisper came again. "Help me." It was closer. Lightning flashed once more. She was standing right behind him. Her face was pale, her lips blue, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. Water dripped from her fingers, her dress, the ends of her hair. The smell of rot filled the air. Aaron choked on a scream. The light vanished. Darkness swallowed the room, and the whisper came one final time. "Help me." Cold hands closed around his wrist. Then the world dissolved. The storm raged on. The house sat in silence, its windows dark. A single car sat in the driveway, its engine off, its driver's seat empty. Inside, the candle still burned. Footprints, wet and glistening, led from the parlor to the staircase. And somewhere upstairs, behind a locked door, the sound of dripping water echoed through the silence. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain fell in an unbroken curtain, drumming against the windshield and blurring the empty road ahead. It was the kind of downpour that swallowed sound, muffling the world in a constant hiss. Jeremy flicked the wipers on full speed, but it hardly made a difference. The dark country road stretched endlessly before him, its edges lost to the creeping fingers of the forest on either side. His gas tank was low, his phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. He should have stayed on the highway. The last sign had promised a gas station just ahead, but that had been at least 10 miles back. Now he was certain he had missed it. Maybe it had shut down years ago, left to rot like so many forgotten places along these back roads. He sighed, glancing at the fuel gauge as it dipped below the last marker. Then he saw it. The gas station appeared out of the mist, a lone structure standing against the darkness. The sign was barely visible, yet its neon glow flickering through the rain. The building itself was old, the paint peeling, the windows dark. A single street lamp buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. Jeremy pulled in, relieved but uneasy. The place looked abandoned. The pumps were ancient, rusted relics from another era. He stepped out, shivering as the cold rain soaked through his jacket in seconds. He tried the pump, but the handle was stiff, unyielding. A faded sign flapped against the side of the station, the words barely legible in the dim light. "Pay inside." Jeremy sighed, wiping rain from his face as he stepped toward the glass door. The interior was dark, but as he approached, he saw a faint glow from within. Someone was inside. He pushed the door open, a bell jingling overhead. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and something faintly metallic. The store was cramped, lined with dusty shelves filled with expired snacks and faded magazines. A small counter stood at the far end, a cash register sitting like a relic from a forgotten time. Behind it, an old man sat. He was thin, his skin stretched tight over his skull, deep wrinkles carving valleys into his face. His eyes were pale, almost milky, staring at nothing. He didn't look up as Jeremy approached. Hey, Jeremy said, clearing his throat. "I need some gas. Pump's not working." The old man didn't respond. Jeremy glanced around, shifting on his feet. The rain hammered the roof, an unrelenting roar that filled the silence between them. "Sir?" The old man's head twitched slightly, then, as if just noticing him, he turned his gaze toward Jeremy. His lips parted, dry and cracked. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Jeremy frowned. "I just need gas. My car's almost empty." The old man shook his head, slow, deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated. Jeremy exhaled sharply, irritation creeping into his voice. "Look, if the station's closed, just say so, and I'll—" Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the store in a stark white glare. And for a brief second, Jeremy saw something. Behind the old man, in the darkened storage room, a figure stood, motionless, watching. The light vanished, plunging the store back into its dim, yellow glow. Jeremy's pulse quickened. He took a step back. Who's back there?" The old man didn't answer. Jeremy's hand twitched toward his pocket, instinctively reaching for his phone, but he already knew. No signal. A shadow shifted in the doorway behind the old man. Then, in a voice that did not belong to him, the old man spoke again. "She's awake." The words sent an icy thread through Jeremy's spine. The rain grew louder, pounding the roof like desperate fingers clawing against the metal. The lights above flickered. Jeremy turned, ready to leave. The bell above the door jingled softly. The door was open. He hadn't touched it. A gust of wet, frigid air rushed in from outside, carrying the scent of damp earth and something rotten. The old man's breath hitched. Jeremy took another step back. Something moved outside. Through the rain-streaked window, just beyond the glow of the street lamp, a shape stood at the edge of the lot. A woman. Or what might have once been a woman. Her hair hung in long, dark strands over her face, her thin body wrapped in a soaked, tattered dress, her head tilted slightly, her arms limp at her sides. The rain should have muffled all sound, but Jeremy swore he could hear her breath, ragged, wet, too close. The old man let out a shaky breath. "You let her in." Jeremy spun toward him. "What? You let her in," the old man whispered. His milky eyes locked onto Jeremy's. "You saw her, and now she sees you." The lights flickered again. A soft, wet sounded against the floor. Jeremy turned slowly. A puddle was forming in the doorway. The rain dripped from something. His breath caught. She was inside. She stood just beyond the entrance, the darkness clinging to her like a second skin. The street lamp outside buzzed and died, plunging the station into a suffocating gloom. The only sound was the rain, the steady drip, drip, drip of water pooling beneath her feet. Then she moved. A whisper of fabric, the slightest shift of shadow. Jeremy stumbled back, knocking over a shelf. Boxes tumbled to the floor. His breath came in sharp gasps. She was closer now. He hadn't seen her move. He scrambled to his feet, bolting toward the door, but as he reached it, the world shifted. The glass reflected something that shouldn't be there. Not the woman, himself. But it wasn't him. The reflection was wrong. His face was pale, hollow. His eyes empty. The air around him thickened. A weight pressed against his chest. He turned to run. The old man was gone. The counter was empty. The room was empty. The rain continued to fall. Jeremy staggered backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The door was still open, leading out into the night. His car sat where he had left it, but something was wrong. The car. The driver's side door was open. The engine was running. A shadow sat in the driver's seat. Jeremy's stomach twisted. His breath came in ragged gasps. He had left the car locked. He knew he had. The figure in the car turned. Through the rain he saw himself. His own face stared back at him. Then it smiled. The world around him stretched, twisted, the air thick with the scent of wet decay. His vision blurred, the gas station warping to swallowed by the rain. And then silence. Jeremy blinked. He was standing at the counter. The old man sat across from him. The lights buzzed overhead, flickering in and out of focus. The bell jingled softly as the door creaked open. The rain poured outside, and at the threshold a man stepped in, soaked, breathless, looking for gas. The old man turned to Jeremy. Jeremy, who now sat behind the counter, his lips cracked open. "You shouldn't be here." Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain drummed against the roof of the old house, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters and sending cold drafts through the narrow hallways. It was a night meant for ghosts, a night where the past did not rest easy. Thomas Jacobs had never believed in such things. He was a man of logic, of reason. He had spent years dismissing the stories about the old Langley house on the edge of town, a house that stood abandoned for nearly a century. It had been a dare. That was how it started. A foolish challenge from his friends, who had grown up hearing the whispers. "Go inside," they said. "Stay for one night. Prove there's nothing there." Thomas had scoffed at their superstitions. A night in an old, empty house? That was nothing. But now, standing in the grand, decayed foyer, he felt a weight settle on his chest. The air was thick, damp, filled with the scent of mildew and forgotten time. A chandelier, caked with dust, hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly despite the stillness of the room. Lightning flashed through the tall, broken windows, casting jagged shadows along the walls. The rain came harder. The house groaned. Something shifted in the darkness. Thomas turned sharply, peering into the gloom. Nothing. Just the empty hallways stretching ahead, yawning like the throat of some great beast. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Just the wind," he muttered. His voice sounded too small, swallowed by the vast silence around him. He had brought a flashlight, but the battery flickered weakly as he swept it across the room. The light revealed dust-covered furniture draped in sheets, their shapes like frozen figures caught mid-motion. He moved forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath his steps. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. The rain, the wind, his own breathing. And something else. A whisper, faint, distant. Thomas stopped. His skin prickled. He turned his flashlight toward the source, a staircase leading upward into deeper darkness. Again, the whisper. It was not the wind, a child's voice, soft, calling. Help me. Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. His mind warred with itself. Old houses creaked, old pipes made noises, drafts carried the wind in strange ways. But this was a voice. Is someone here? He called, his voice stronger than he felt. Silence. Then footsteps, soft, deliberate, above him. Thomas turned his flashlight to the staircase. He saw only dust-covered steps leading up into blackness. His heart pounded. His friends had locked the doors when they left him here. He had watched them do it. No one else was supposed to be in this house, but someone was. He placed a hand on the banister, his fingers leaving a mark in the thick layer of dust. Slowly he ascended. Each step groaned beneath his weight. The upstairs hallway was worse, narrow, suffocating, the wallpaper peeling away in long curling strips. Lightning flashed again. For a moment, he saw her. A girl, standing at the end of the hall, small, pale, her dress old-fashioned and tattered, her face was hidden in shadow. Then darkness returned. Thomas felt his breath hitch. The whisper again, "Help me." The flashlight flickered. The air was colder here. Thomas forced himself forward, the boards beneath him protesting. She was gone. A door hung open at the end of the hall, swaying slightly as though it had just been touched. Thomas hesitated before stepping inside. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair near the window. The storm outside pressed against the glass, lightning flashing once more. The chair rocked gently, as though someone had just been sitting there. His flashlight dimmed further. A voice, directly behind him now. "You shouldn't have come." Thomas spun, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. But he could feel it now. A presence, watching. The rain roared against the house, the wind screamed through the cracks. Then the door slammed shut. Thomas lunged for it, his fingers scrabbling against the wood. He pulled, pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper turned into a sob. "Please, help me." He turned, and this time she was there. The girl. No longer a shadow, but fully formed. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes wide, hollow. And behind her, a shape in the darkness. Tall, wrong, reaching. The girl screamed. The lights died, and Thomas Jacobs was never seen again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, when the rain pounds against the old Langley house and the wind howls through the trees, a whisper can be heard, soft, desperate. "Help me." Story the end.